I was 52 when I learned that loyalty is a one-way street, and I was the only one walking down it. My colleagues, my team, the people I'd mentored for years, left me standing in the pouring rain at a bus stop like I was nothing more than yesterday's trash. They drove past in their warm, dry car, laughing, while I stood there soaked to the bone. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't just an employee anymore. I was their new boss. And sometimes, the best revenge is simply doing your job. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Josephine Miller, and for 12 years, I was the backbone of Henderson & Associates marketing firm in downtown Chicago. Not the face of the company, mind you. That honor belonged to the silver-haired executives who swooped into client meetings to shake hands and take credit. I was something more valuable. I was the person who made things work. Every morning at 6:47 a.m., I walked through the glass doors of our Michigan Avenue office building, my heels clicking against the polished marble floors with the kind of precision that comes from routine. I wasn't the first one in. That distinction belonged to Marcus, the security guard who'd nod and say, "Morning, Ms. Miller," with genuine warmth. But I was always the first one in my department. Henderson & Associates was one of those mid-sized firms that punched above its weight. We weren't the biggest marketing agency in Chicago, but we were scrappy, creative, and we delivered results. Our client roster read like a who's who of Midwest businesses: restaurant chains, manufacturing companies, tech startups that had grown into something substantial. The kind of accounts that paid well and expected excellence. I ran the creative strategy department, a team of 8 people who ranged from fresh-faced college graduates with heads full of digital marketing theories to seasoned professionals who remembered when a successful campaign meant a good print ad and a catchy radio jingle. My office was a corner space on the 14th floor, nothing fancy but with 2 windows that offered a slice of Lake Michigan if you pressed your face against the glass and looked north. The work itself was demanding, but never felt like work to me. I loved the puzzle of it. Taking a client's vision, their constraints, their fears about their competition, and turning all of that into something that would make people stop scrolling, stop channel surfing, stop whatever they were doing, and pay attention. There's a particular satisfaction in creating something from nothing, in seeing a blank whiteboard transform into a campaign that could change the trajectory of someone's business. My team trusted me because I'd earned it. When Sarah Chen joined us straight out of Northwestern with a marketing degree and enough anxiety to power a small city, I spent hours walking her through client presentations until she could pitch with confidence. When David Rodriguez came to me with an idea for an interactive social media campaign that seemed impossible to execute, I found the budget and the resources to make it happen. When the economy took a downturn in 2019 and the company started making noises about layoffs, I worked 16-hour days restructuring our processes and proving our department's value until every single person on my team kept their job. But it wasn't just about the work. These people became my chosen family, in the way that happens when you spend more waking hours with your colleagues than with anyone else in your life. We celebrated birthdays with sheet cake in the conference room. We commiserated over failed campaigns and celebrated wins with drinks at O'Malley's, the Irish pub 3 blocks away that became our unofficial headquarters after 5 p.m. When David's father passed away, we all pitched in to cover his projects so he could take time off without worrying. When Sarah got engaged, we threw her an impromptu party that lasted until building security politely asked us to leave. Man, I thought we were a team. I thought loyalty flowed both ways. The first sign that something was shifting came in the form of a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. It was a Thursday afternoon in late September, and I was working late in my office, wrestling with budget projections for the 4th quarter. The cleaning crew had already been through, leaving behind the faint scent of lemon disinfectant and the kind of pristine emptiness that only exists in office buildings after hours. I was reaching for a file when I heard voices drifting from the break room down the hall. The acoustics in our building were strange. Sound traveled in unexpected ways, bouncing off glass walls and steel beams. I recognized the voices immediately. Tom Bradley and Jessica Walsh, two of my senior strategists, and Kevin Murphy from the account management team. She's been here forever, Tom was saying, his voice carrying that particular tone people use when they think they're being clever. Sometimes I wonder if she even knows what year it is. Jessica laughed, a sound that felt like a small betrayal. Did you see her trying to figure out the new project management software? It was painful to watch. The woman still prints out emails, Kevin added. Prints them out and files them in actual folders. It's like watching someone use a rotary phone. I stood frozen in my office, my hand still extended toward the filing cabinet. They were talking about me. These people I'd mentored, supported, fought for. They were discussing me like I was some relic from a bygone era, some obstacle to their professional advancement. The industry's changing so fast, Tom continued. We need leadership that understands where things are heading, not someone who's stuck in the past. Don't get me wrong, Jessica said, and I could hear the false diplomacy in her voice. Josephine's done great things for this company, but maybe it's time for fresh blood in leadership roles. I quietly closed my office door and sat down at my desk, staring at my computer screen without really seeing it. The budget projections blurred as I tried to process what I'd just heard. These weren't strangers making casual observations about my age or my technological competence. These were people I'd hired, trained, and trusted with increasingly important responsibilities. Over the following weeks, I began to notice things I'd previously overlooked or dismissed. The way conversations stopped when I entered a room. The subtle exclusion from informal gatherings and lunch plans. The way certain emails seemed to circulate among team members without making it to my inbox. It wasn't dramatic or overt. Nothing I could point to and definitively say was unprofessional. It was more like a slow withdrawal of warmth, a gradual cooling of relationships I'd thought were built on mutual respect. The technology comments stung because they contained just enough truth to be effective. Yes, I did print out important emails, not because I didn't understand digital filing systems, but because I'd learned through experience that having a physical backup of crucial communications had saved my department more than once when servers crashed or files mysteriously disappeared. Yes, it took me longer to adapt to new software platforms, but I always got there, and I made sure my entire team was properly trained on any system we implemented. But I began to see how my methodical approach to new technology could be interpreted as resistance to change. How my preference for face-to-face meetings over Slack conversations could be seen as old-fashioned rather than relationship building. How my insistence on thorough documentation could appear bureaucratic to people who preferred to move fast and figure things out as they went. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent years protecting my team from exactly this kind of generational bias, making sure that older employees weren't pushed aside for younger, cheaper alternatives. I'd advocated for diversity in hiring, and not just the kind of diversity that shows up in company brochures. I'd fought for diversity of experience, of perspective, of approach. I'd believed that our department was stronger because it included people who remembered marketing before the internet, and people who'd never known a world without social media. Now I was discovering that some of those same people I'd protected viewed me as deadweight. The realization settled over me slowly, like watching storm clouds gather on a distant horizon. You know the weather is going to change, but for a while, you can still feel the sun on your face and pretend the wind isn't picking up. I started paying closer attention to office dynamics, watching interactions with the kind of analytical eye I usually reserved for consumer behavior studies. I noticed how Tom had begun positioning himself as the unofficial spokesman for our department in meetings with upper management. I saw how Jessica had started taking credit for collaborative projects, subtly editing my contributions out of final presentations. I observed how Kevin seemed to have developed a direct line to our director, bypassing me entirely on decisions that should have come through my desk. They weren't planning a coup exactly. It was more like they were slowly writing me out of the story, making me irrelevant through 1,000 small exclusions and redirections. And the most painful part was that they were doing it with the efficiency and strategic thinking I'd taught them. By November, I felt like a stranger in my own department, watching from the outside as my team moved forward without me. But I was still their supervisor, still responsible for their work, still accountable when projects succeeded or failed. I was caught in a peculiar kind of professional limbo, too experienced to ignore, too outdated to include. That's when I made my first decision. I was going to start documenting everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The corporate restructuring announcement came on a Tuesday morning in early December, delivered via email at 8:43 a.m. with the kind of carefully neutral language that only HR departments can craft. Henderson & Associates is excited to announce a strategic reorganization designed to position our company for continued growth and innovation in the evolving marketing landscape. I read the email twice before the implications sank in. The company was creating a new position, Director of Digital Innovation. The role would oversee all creative strategy moving forward, with a particular focus on emerging technologies and next-generation marketing solutions. Applications were being accepted internally for the next 2 weeks. Loch. My coffee went cold as I stared at the screen. This wasn't just a new position. This was my position, repackaged and rebranded for someone younger, someone more digitally native, someone who didn't print out emails or ask clarifying questions about software updates. Within an hour, I knew who would be applying. Tom Bradley walked past my office 3 times that morning, each time with a slightly different expression of barely contained excitement. During the 10 a.m. department meeting, Jessica peppered her project updates with references to digital transformation and innovative approaches to customer engagement. Kevin from account management stopped by my office to ask if I'd heard about the exciting new opportunities the company was creating. The message was clear. They saw this as their chance to step up and my chance to step aside. That afternoon, I requested a meeting with Richard Henderson III, the company's president and son of the founder. Richard was one of those executives who managed to be both approachable and intimidating, the kind of man who remembered your birthday but could fire you without blinking. His office occupied the entire northeast corner of the 20th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. "Josephine," he said, gesturing toward the leather chairs arranged around a small conference table. "Good to see you. I assume this is about the director position?" I sat down and placed my portfolio on the table between us. Inside were 12 years of performance reviews, client testimonials, revenue reports, and project summaries. The documentation I'd been compiling over the past month had evolved into something more comprehensive, a detailed record of my contributions to the company's success. "I want to apply for the position," I said simply. Richard smiled, but it was the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Of course you do, and you should. Your experience with this company is invaluable." He paused, and I heard the unspoken "but" hanging in the air. "I have to ask, though, do you feel prepared for the technological aspects of the role? The board is very focused on digital transformation, artificial intelligence integration, social commerce platforms." I opened my portfolio and pulled out a bound presentation. "I've been leading digital campaigns for the past 8 years, I said, sliding the document across the table. "The Morrison Restaurant Group's app-based loyalty program increased customer retention by 34%. The Midwest Manufacturing social media strategy generated $2.3 million in new business over 18 months. The tech startup package for Innovate Corp resulted in their successful Series B funding round." Richard flipped through the presentation, his expression shifting from polite interest to genuine surprise. "I hadn't realized the scope of your digital work. Most people don't," I said. "They see the printed emails and assume I'm technologically challenged. But I've been adapting to industry changes for over a decade. The difference is that I don't make a show of it." We talked for another 20 minutes. I walked him through specific campaigns, explained my approach to emerging technologies, and outlined my vision for the department's future. When I left his office, I felt cautiously optimistic. Maybe my colleagues' whisper campaign hadn't been as effective as they'd hoped. That optimism lasted exactly 4 days. I was working late on Friday evening, putting the finishing touches on my formal application for the director position, when I heard familiar voices in the hallway. Tom and Jessica were heading toward the elevator, their conversation carrying in the empty building. "Did you see Henderson's reaction when I mentioned the AI integration proposal?" Tom was saying. "He was eating it up." "Your presentation was brilliant," Jessica replied, "especially the part about modernizing the department's leadership structure. Very diplomatic way of saying what everyone's thinking." I quietly moved to my office door and listened. The best part is that she's doing our work for us, Tom continued. Every time Josephine asks a basic question about new software, or suggests we slow down and think this through, she proves our point. Henderson can see that she's not equipped for where the industry is heading. I almost felt bad during yesterday's strategy meeting, Jessica said, when she couldn't figure out how to share her screen for the presentation, and we all just sat there watching her struggle with the interface. Don't feel bad, Tom laughed. She's had 12 years to figure this stuff out. Besides, we're not pushing her out, we're just positioning ourselves for advancement. It's business. The elevator doors opened, and their voices faded as they descended toward the lobby. I stood in my doorway for a long moment, processing what I'd just heard. They weren't just competing for the same position, they were actively working to undermine my candidacy. Over the weekend, I made some phone calls. Professional contacts, former colleagues, people in the industry who might have insights about Henderson and Associates' strategic direction. What I learned was illuminating and deeply unsettling. The company was under pressure from its largest clients to demonstrate innovation. 3 major accounts had recently hinted that they might be seeking agencies with more cutting-edge capabilities. The board was pushing for younger leadership across all departments, viewing it as essential for the company's survival in an increasingly competitive market. More troubling was what I learned about Tom's activities outside the office. He'd been networking aggressively, attending industry conferences and digital marketing seminars that he'd somehow managed to get the company to pay for. He'd presented himself as the creative mind behind several campaigns that I'd actually spearheaded, subtly editing my contributions out of his conference presentations and LinkedIn posts. Jessica, meanwhile, had been taking graduate courses in digital marketing at Northwestern, using tuition reimbursement benefits to position herself as an expert in emerging technologies. She'd been publishing articles on marketing blogs, always identifying herself as a senior strategist at Henderson and Associates, without mentioning that she worked under my supervision. They'd been building their cases for promotion for months, maybe years, while I'd been focused on simply doing the job well. Monday morning brought a new revelation. I arrived at the office to find that my access to several key software platforms had been restricted. When I called IT, they explained that there had been a reorganization of user permissions as part of the company's security upgrade. Only department heads and senior management would maintain full access to client databases and project management systems. The message was unmistakable. I was being treated as if my departure was inevitable. During that week's department meeting, Tom unveiled what he called his digital strategy roadmap, a comprehensive plan for modernizing our client approach that heavily emphasized automation, AI-driven analytics, and social media integration. It was polished, forward-thinking, and completely ignored the foundational relationship building and strategic thinking that had made our department successful. "This is impressive work, Tom," said Carol Wright, our VP of Client Services, who'd been invited to observe the meeting. "Very innovative approach." I raised my hand. "I have some concerns about implementation timelines and client readiness for this level of technological integration." The room went quiet. Carol smiled politely. "What kind of concerns?" I outlined my thoughts methodically. The importance of testing new approaches with smaller clients before rolling them out company-wide, the need to maintain personal relationships even as we increased automation, the risk of alienating older decision-makers who value traditional communication methods. When I finished, Tom leaned forward with a condescending smile. "Those are valid points, Josephine, but I think we have to trust that our clients are ready to embrace the future. We can't let fear of change hold us back." Jessica nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. We need to lead our clients into new territory, not follow them." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. They'd reframed my experience-based caution as fear, my strategic thinking as resistance to progress. And everyone in the room was nodding along. After the meeting, Carol pulled me aside. "Josephine, can I give you some advice? The industry is changing rapidly, and companies need leaders who can change with it. You might want to consider how you're positioning yourself in these discussions." That night, I sat in my apartment overlooking Lincoln Park and made a decision that would change everything. I pulled out my laptop and began typing an email to Richard Henderson III. But instead of pleading my case for the director position, I was writing something else entirely. I was applying for a different job, one that my colleagues didn't even know existed yet. 3 months earlier, I'd learned through industry contacts that Henderson and Associates was being considered for acquisition by Meridian Marketing Group, a national agency looking to expand their Midwest presence. The talks were confidential, conducted entirely at the board level, but I'd pieced together enough information to understand that any acquisition would likely result in a complete restructuring of our leadership team. What my colleagues didn't realize was that I'd been quietly building relationships with key decision-makers at Meridian for over a year. They valued exactly what Tom and Jessica saw as weaknesses: experience, stability, proven results over flashy innovation. My email to Richard was brief and professional. I was withdrawing my application for the Director of Digital Innovation position. I felt it was time for fresh leadership in that role, and I'd be happy to work with whoever was selected to ensure a smooth transition. What I didn't mention was that I'd just accepted a position as Regional Operations Director for Meridian Marketing Group's new Chicago division. My first responsibility would be conducting due diligence on potential acquisition targets, including Henderson and Associates. The turning point wasn't just about a job posting or a reorganization. It was about the moment I realized that while my colleagues were playing office politics, I'd been building something bigger. They thought they were moving me aside, but they'd actually moved themselves directly into my line of sight. And I was about to become their boss. The office holiday party was scheduled for December 18th at the Palmer House Hilton, one of those elaborate affairs that Henderson and Associates threw every year, to celebrate another successful season and thank employees for their dedication. What made this year different was that it would serve as the unofficial announcement of Tom Bradley's promotion to Director of Digital Innovation. I learned about his selection the way I'd been learning most things lately, by accident, through conversations I wasn't meant to overhear. Richard Henderson had called Tom into his office on a Thursday afternoon, and by Friday morning, the entire creative department was buzzing with barely contained excitement. The official announcement wouldn't come until after the holidays, but everyone knew. What they didn't know was that I'd already cleaned out my desk. My last day at Henderson and Associates was supposed to be December 23rd. I'd submitted my resignation letter the previous Monday, citing new opportunities and expressing gratitude for my 12 years with the company. Richard had seemed genuinely surprised and somewhat disappointed, but he accepted my 2 weeks' notice without question. After all, it solved a delicate problem for him: how to gracefully transition me out of a leadership role without the messiness of termination or demotion. I'd planned to slip away quietly, maybe send a group email on my final day wishing everyone well. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. The betrayal that would cement my resolve happened on December 16th, during what should have been a routine client presentation for Hartwell Industries, our second-largest account. I'd been managing the Hartwell relationship for 8 years, ever since they'd been a mid-sized manufacturing company with dreams of national expansion. Now they were a $200 million operation with facilities in 12 states, and their quarterly marketing budget was larger than what most companies spent in a year. The presentation was for their 2024 strategic campaign, a comprehensive approach that would launch their new product line while reinforcing their brand identity in emerging markets. I'd spent 6 weeks developing the strategy, working closely with their CEO, Michael Hartwell, and their marketing director, Patricia Santos. It was exactly the kind of complex, relationship-driven project that I excelled at, one that required understanding not just market data and consumer behavior, but the personalities and concerns of the decision-makers themselves. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. in our main conference room. I arrived 15 minutes early to set up the presentation materials, only to find Tom, Jessica, and Kevin already seated at the table with laptops open and confident smiles on their faces. "Oh, good, you're here," Tom said without looking up from his screen. "We've made some adjustments to the presentation. Nothing major, just some updates to align with the new department direction." I set down my materials and stared at him. "What adjustments?" Jessica turned her laptop toward me, revealing a completely redesigned presentation that bore only a passing resemblance to the strategy I'd developed. Gone were the careful market segmentation analyses and the phased rollout timeline. In their place was a flashy, technology-heavy approach that emphasized social media virality and influencer partnerships. "We modernized it," she explained with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she genuinely believed she was helping. "The original strategy was solid, but it felt a bit traditional. We thought Hartwell deserved something more cutting edge." "You thought," I repeated slowly. Did anyone think to consult with me before redesigning my presentation? Kevin looked uncomfortable for the first time. We tried to reach you yesterday, but you'd already left for the day. I left at 6:30, after a 12-hour day. Look, Tom interjected. This isn't about credit or ownership. It's about giving our client the best possible strategy. And honestly, Josephine, your approach was great for 2015, but Hartwell needs to think bigger. The conference room door opened, and Richard Henderson walked in with Michael Hartwell and Patricia Santos. Introductions were made, coffee was poured, and everyone settled in for what they expected to be a routine presentation of brilliant marketing strategy. Tom took the lead, clicking through slides with practiced confidence. He outlined a campaign that would leverage micro-influencers to create authentic engagement touchpoints and utilize AI-driven content optimization to maximize reach efficiency. The presentation was full of buzzwords and trending concepts that sounded impressive but lacked substance. Michael Hartwell listened politely, asking occasional questions that Tom answered with varying degrees of accuracy. Patricia Santos took notes but looked increasingly skeptical as the presentation progressed. I sat at the far end of the table, watching my 8-year relationship with this client being bulldozed by people who'd never had a conversation with them outside of formal meetings. When Tom finished, Michael leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "This is certainly innovative," he said finally. "But I have to ask, where's the customer retention component? And what about our existing dealer network? They're not exactly the influencer demographic." Tom's confident smile flickered. "Well, we believe that reaching new audiences will ultimately drive overall growth. But what about our current customers?" Patricia pressed. "The ones who've been with us for 10, 15 years? The ones who make up 70% of our revenue?" I watched Tom fumble for an answer, throwing around terms like cross-platform integration and omni-channel experiences without addressing the actual question. Jessica jumped in to help, but she only made things worse by suggesting that traditional customers would naturally adapt to new engagement methods. Finally, Michael turned to me. "Josephine, you've been quiet. What's your take on this approach?" The room went silent. I could feel Tom and Jessica's eyes on me, willing me to support their presentation, to be a team player, to gracefully accept that my time had passed. Richard Henderson leaned forward slightly, probably hoping I wouldn't embarrass the agency by contradicting my colleagues in front of a major client. I opened my portfolio and pulled out the original strategy document. "Michael, you and I have worked together for 8 years. In that time, Hartwell Industries has grown from $45 million to $200 million in annual revenue. That growth came from understanding your customers, respecting your existing relationships, and building on strengths rather than chasing trends." I handed him the document. "This strategy honors that approach while incorporating digital elements that make sense for your business model. It's not as flashy as what you just saw, but it's designed specifically for Hartwell Industries, not for some generic company that exists only in marketing textbooks." Michael opened the folder and began reading. Patricia leaned over to look at the pages with him. The room remained uncomfortably quiet as they reviewed my work. "This is more like it," Michael said after several minutes. "This understands our business. This builds on what we've already accomplished." He looked up at Tom. "Your presentation was very creative, but it felt like you were trying to solve problems we don't have while ignoring the ones we do." Tom's face went red. "Sir, with respect, we were trying to position Hartwell for future growth." "Future growth that ignores current customers isn't growth," Michael interrupted. "It's a recipe for bankruptcy." He turned to Richard. "I'd like to move forward with Josephine's strategy. When can we schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss implementation?" The silence that followed was deafening. Richard looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. Tom stared at his laptop screen as if it might provide an escape route. Jessica was making notes with unnecessary intensity, probably trying to figure out how to salvage something from the wreckage. "Actually," I said, closing my portfolio, "I won't be available for follow-up meetings. Today is my last day managing the Hartwell account." Michael's expression shifted to alarm. "What do you mean?" "I'm leaving Henderson & Associates. My last day is next week." The meeting devolved into chaos after that. Michael demanded to know why the agency's most successful account manager was leaving. Richard tried to maintain diplomatic composure while privately panicking about losing a major client. Tom and Jessica attempted to position themselves as capable successors, but their credibility had been thoroughly demolished by the failed presentation. In the end, Michael Hartwell stood up and announced that Hartwell Industries would be, reevaluating their agency relationship in the new year. He shook my hand and said he hoped we could work together again someday. Patricia Santos asked for my business card, which I promised to send her once I was settled in my new position. After they left, Richard asked to speak with me privately. We walked to his office in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over both of us. "Josephine," he said once we were seated, "I think there's been a misunderstanding about your role here, about the direction we're heading. Maybe we should discuss." "There's no misunderstanding," I interrupted. "What happened in that meeting is exactly what I expected to happen. Tom and Jessica redesigned my presentation because they assumed they knew better than I did about my own client. They didn't consult me because they didn't think my input was valuable. And you allowed it because you've already decided I'm not part of this company's future." Richard was quiet for a moment. "Where are you going? Who's hiring you?" I smiled for the first time in weeks. "I'll be working with Meridian Marketing Group. They're expanding their Midwest operations." I watched his face change as the implications sank in. Meridian wasn't just any agency. They were Henderson and Associates' biggest competitor in the region, and they'd been aggressively pursuing market share for the past 2 years. "Josephine," he said carefully, "you know there are non-compete clauses in your employment contract." "I've had my lawyer review them thoroughly," I replied. "They're unenforceable given the circumstances of my departure. But don't worry, I have no intention of stealing clients or proprietary information. I'm simply moving on to a new opportunity." What I didn't tell him was that Meridian had acquired Henderson and Associates 3 days earlier. The deal was still confidential, pending final approvals and transition planning, but I'd been briefed on my new responsibilities as Regional Operations Director. My first task would be conducting a comprehensive review of Henderson's operations and recommending staffing changes for the integrated organization. I left Richard's office and walked back to my desk to gather my personal belongings. Tom was waiting for me, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. "I hope you're happy," he said. "You just cost us our second biggest client." "I didn't cost you anything," I replied, placing my coffee mug in the cardboard box I'd brought from home. "You did that yourselves when you decided that innovation meant ignoring everything that actually works. This is about the promotion, isn't it?" Jessica appeared beside him, her arms crossed. "You're sabotaging the department because you didn't get the job you wanted." I looked at both of them, these people I'd mentored and supported and trusted, and felt something cold settle in my chest. They genuinely believed that I was the problem, that my departure was an act of spite, rather than a response to their systematic campaign to undermine me. "Jess, you know what?" I said, taping up the box. "You're right. This is about the promotion. Congratulations, Tom, you got exactly what you wanted. I hope it works out for you." I picked up my box and walked toward the elevator, leaving them standing in the creative department they'd fought so hard to control. As the elevator doors closed, I caught a glimpse of their faces, triumphant, relieved, vindicated. They had no idea that in 6 weeks I'd be back. Not as a colleague, not as a subordinate, but as the person who would decide whether they still had jobs. The betrayal was complete, but so was my preparation for what came next. The rain started at 3:47 p.m. on my final Friday at Henderson and Associates, turning what should have been a routine departure into something that would crystallize every feeling of betrayal I'd experienced over the past months. Chicago's December weather had been unpredictable all week, sudden temperature drops, unexpected snow flurries, and now this, a cold, driving rain that seemed to come from nowhere and soak through everything. I'd spent my last day completing transition documents and tying up loose ends. The official story was that I was leaving for new opportunities, but everyone in the office knew the real narrative. The old guard was stepping aside for fresh leadership. Tom Bradley had been strutting around the office all week, already acting like the director of digital innovation, despite the fact that his official start date wasn't until January 2nd. Jessica Walsh had been appointed as acting creative director in my absence, a temporary title that everyone understood would become permanent once the dust settled. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was documenting processes and client relationships for the same people who'd spent months documenting my supposed inadequacies. By 5:30 p.m., the office had largely emptied out. It was the Friday before Christmas week, and most people had either left early for holiday parties or simply decided to start their weekend. I finished packing the last of my personal items, a small desk plant that had somehow survived 12 Chicago winters, a photo of my parents from their 40th anniversary, and a coffee-stained copy of The Art of Strategic Thinking that had been my Bible during my early management years. As I prepared to leave, I realized I'd made a critical error in planning. I'd taken the CTA to work that morning instead of driving. It had seemed like a good idea at the time. The Blue Line was reliable, parking downtown was expensive, and I'd wanted to use the commute time to mentally prepare for my final day. But now, standing at my office window and watching sheets of rain sweep across Michigan Avenue, I regretted that decision. Pura. The weather app on my phone was no help. The rain was expected to continue for several hours, with no sign of letting up. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since noon, turning what might have been a manageable winter shower into the kind of bone-chilling precipitation that cuts right through any clothing that isn't specifically designed for it. I called an Uber, but the app showed a 25-minute wait time and surge pricing that would cost more than my monthly CTA pass. I called a traditional taxi company, but they put me on hold for so long that I eventually hung up. The building's concierge suggested I wait in the lobby until the weather improved, but the radar showed this storm system stretching across 3 states. Finally, I accepted the inevitable. I was going to have to make a run for the Blue Line station 6 blocks away. I put on my wool coat, wrapped my scarf tightly around my neck, and tucked my cardboard box of belongings under my jacket as best I could. The lobby of our building was bustling with people facing the same dilemma. Some were calling for rides, others were debating whether to wait it out, and a few brave souls were venturing into the storm with umbrellas that immediately turned inside out in the wind. I was standing near the revolving door, gathering my courage for the sprint to the train station, when I heard familiar laughter behind me. Tom, Jessica, and Kevin Murphy were standing near the elevators, apparently just arriving from somewhere rather than leaving. Tom was shaking rain off his jacket, but all 3 of them looked relatively dry and remarkably cheerful for people who just braved the storm. "Oh, good," Jessica said when she spotted me. "You haven't left yet. Perfect timing." I turned toward them, confused. Perfect timing for what? "We were just coming back from Murphy's Pub," Kevin explained. "Early celebration for Tom's promotion. We thought you might want to join us for a quick farewell drink." Tom grinned, and there was something in his expression that made me uneasy. "Come on, Josephine. One last hurrah for the old team. We can give you a ride home afterward." I looked at the 3 of them, dry, warm, clearly having planned this encounter, and then at the storm raging outside. The offer was tempting, but something felt off about the whole situation. "That's kind of you," I said carefully, "but I should probably head home. It's been a long day." "Are you sure?" Jessica pressed. "It's absolutely miserable out there, and we've got Kevin's car right here in the garage." Kevin nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, no problem at all. We're all heading north anyway." For a moment I considered it. The rational part of my brain pointed out that accepting a ride would be the smart choice. Dry, warm, and considerably faster than public transportation in this weather. But the part of me that had been reading office politics for the past few months sensed something performative about their sudden friendliness. "Thanks, but I'll manage," I said. "Enjoy your celebration." I pushed through the revolving door before they could argue further and immediately regretted my decision. The rain was even worse than it had looked from inside. Not just heavy, but driven by wind that seemed to change direction every few seconds. Within half a block my shoes were soaked through, and water was running down my neck despite the scarf. I ducked into doorways when I could, but most of the buildings were locked up for the evening, and the few restaurants and shops that were open were packed with other refugees from the storm. By the time I reached the intersection of LaSalle and Madison, I was thoroughly miserable and beginning to question my stubbornness. Nimburasatay, that's when I heard the car horn. I looked up to see Kevin's silver BMW pulling alongside me, windows down just enough for the occupants to shout over the wind and rain. "Last chance," Tom called out. "We're heading your way." I was standing at a bus stop, huddled under a shelter that provided minimal protection from the sideways rain. My cardboard box was disintegrating, and I could feel water seeping through my coat. Every rational instinct told me to accept their offer. But something made me hesitate. Maybe it was the way they were all grinning, like they were enjoying my predicament. Maybe it was the fact that they'd waited until I was thoroughly soaked before making their second offer. Or maybe it was simply that I'd spent too many months feeling manipulated by these people to trust their sudden generosity. "I'm fine," I called back, trying to project more confidence than I felt. "See you around." Tom shrugged and rolled up his window. "Suit yourself." And then they drove away. I stood there for a moment, watching their taillights disappear into the storm, and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly, and not surprise. I'd expected them to be petty in their victory, but there was a crystallizing clarity about what had just happened. They'd offered me a ride, but only after watching me struggle in the rain for several blocks. They'd positioned themselves as generous colleagues, but only after ensuring I was desperate enough to be grateful for their help. And when I declined their offer, they'd driven away without a second thought, leaving me standing in a storm that was getting worse by the minute. It was a perfect microcosm of our entire relationship over the past months. Conditional support, strategic kindness, and the assumption that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of consideration they chose to throw my way. The bus shelter provided minimal protection, and the digital sign indicated that the next bus wouldn't arrive for another 18 minutes. I pulled out my phone to check the CTA app, but the screen was fogged with condensation and barely responsive to my cold, wet fingers. That's when the universe decided to add insult to injury. A taxi pulled up to the curb, not one I'd called, but apparently dropping off a passenger at the office building across the street. I hurried toward it, cardboard box falling apart in my arms, hoping to catch the driver before he pulled away. I was 3 steps from the cab when another car pulled up behind it. Kevin's BMW, returning from whatever direction they'd been heading. Tom rolled down the passenger window again. "Josephine," he called out, "we changed our minds. Hop in." The taxi driver looked between me and the BMW, clearly trying to figure out the situation. I was standing in the street, rain streaming down my face, holding the remnants of a cardboard box full of my professional life. "Actually," I said to the taxi driver, "I'll take the cab." "You sure?" the driver asked. "Your friends seem eager to help." I looked back at the BMW, where all 3 of my former colleagues were staring at me with expressions that ranged from confusion to amusement. Tom was shaking his head like I was being ridiculous. Jessica was saying something to Kevin that I couldn't hear over the rain. "They're not my friends," I said clearly, loud enough for everyone to hear. The taxi driver nodded and popped the trunk so I could load what remained of my belongings. As I climbed into the back seat, I caught one last glimpse of the BMW through the rain-streaked window. Tom was gesturing animatedly, probably explaining to the others how unreasonable I was being, how ungrateful, how typical of someone from my generation. They drove away first, heading north toward whatever celebration they'd planned. I gave the taxi driver my address and settled back into the warm, dry interior of the cab. "Rough day?" the driver asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "Rough few months," I replied, "but it's about to get better." As we drove through the storm-soaked streets of Chicago, I thought about the symbolism of what had just happened. I'd been offered a ride, but only on their terms, only when it served their narrative of magnanimous colleagues helping a struggling former supervisor. When I refused to play that role, they'd simply driven away, leaving me to face the storm alone. But here's what they didn't understand. I wasn't afraid of storms. I'd been through plenty of them in my career, and I'd learned that sometimes you have to get soaked before you find your way to dry ground. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Patricia Santos at Hartwell Industries, responding to the business card I'd promised to send her. "Josephine, I heard through the grapevine that you're joining Meridian. Would love to discuss bringing Hartwell over when our contract comes up for renewal. Call me next week?" I smiled and typed back, "Absolutely. Looking forward to continuing our partnership." The taxi pulled up to my apartment building, and I paid the driver with a generous tip. As I stood under the covered entrance, fishing for my keys, I realized something. I wasn't cold anymore. The rain had stopped, the wind had died down, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe easily. My former colleagues thought they'd left me standing in the rain, abandoned and defeated. What they didn't know was that they'd actually left me exactly where I needed to be, free of their expectations, free of their manipulations, and free to show them what real professional consequences looked like. In 6 weeks I'd be back, not as someone seeking their approval or hoping for their acceptance, but as someone with the power to make decisions about their futures. The storm was over, but theirs was just beginning. The call came at 6:23 a.m. on January 8th, 3 days into my official start date at Meridian Marketing Group. I was in my new office on the 28th floor of the Willis Tower, watching the sunrise paint Chicago's skyline in shades of gold and amber, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Ms. Miller? This is Amanda Chen from the Chicago Tribune's business desk. I'm working on a story about the Meridian Henderson acquisition, and I was hoping to get your perspective as someone who recently transitioned between the companies. I nearly choked on my coffee. I'm sorry, what acquisition? There was a pause. The Meridian Marketing Group acquisition of Henderson & Associates. It was announced this morning in a joint press release. You weren't aware? I set down my coffee cup with hands that had suddenly become unsteady. Could you email me a copy of that press release? Of course. Should I use the Meridian email address in your LinkedIn profile? After I hung up, I sat in the pre-dawn quiet of my office, staring at my computer screen and waiting for the email that would confirm what I was starting to suspect. When Amanda Chen's message arrived 3 minutes later, I opened the attachment with a mixture of anticipation and disbelief. Meridian Marketing Group announces strategic acquisition of Henderson & Associates, expanding Midwest market leadership. The press release was dated that morning, but it referenced negotiations that had been ongoing for, quote, several months, and due diligence that had been, quote, completed in December. The acquisition was valued at $47 million and would result in the integration of Henderson's operations into Meridian's expanding Chicago division. Most significantly, the press release announced that the combined operations would be overseen by, quote, newly appointed Regional Operations Director Josephine Miller, a veteran marketing executive with extensive experience in both strategic planning and client relationship management. I read the press release 3 times before the full implications settled in. Meridian hadn't just hired me as a regional director, they'd hired me to oversee the integration of my former company. Everything I'd assumed about coincidental timing and fortunate opportunities was wrong. This had been planned from the beginning. My desk phone rang and I recognized the extension. David Meridian himself, the founder and CEO of Meridian Marketing Group. Josephine, his voice was warm but businesslike. I assume you've seen the announcement. I hope you're not too surprised. Surprised is an understatement, I replied. When exactly were you planning to tell me that you'd bought my former employer? David chuckled. We've been finalizing the details for weeks. The timing had to be perfect. Legally, financially, and strategically. We needed the Henderson team to operate normally through their transition period, which meant keeping the acquisition confidential until after the holidays. And my hiring? Was always connected to this acquisition. Josephine, we didn't hire you despite your history with Henderson & Associates. We hired you because of it. You understand their operations, their client relationships, their personnel dynamics. You're the key to making this integration successful. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what I was hearing. So when I applied for this position, we'd already identified you as our preferred candidate for the integration role. Your application just made the process easier for everyone involved. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, during which David outlined my responsibilities for the coming weeks. I would be conducting comprehensive reviews of Henderson's operations, identifying redundancies, assessing personnel, and recommending organizational changes. The goal was to complete the integration within 90 days while retaining key clients and talent. One more thing, David said before hanging up. There will likely be resistance from some Henderson employees. People don't like change, especially when it involves oversight from someone they consider a former peer. You'll need to be prepared for that. After the call ended, I sat alone in my office, watching Chicago wake up below me. The early morning commuters were beginning to fill the streets, tiny figures hurrying through the cold January morning toward offices, where they assumed their professional lives would continue unchanged. In one of those offices, 14 floors below and 6 blocks south, my former colleagues were probably just learning about the acquisition that would reshape their careers. I wondered if Tom Bradley was still feeling confident about his promotion. I wondered if Jessica Walsh was still planning her department reorganization. I wondered if any of them had connected the dots between my departure and the announcement they were reading. At 8:47 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text message from a number I recognized. Tom Bradley. Holy shit, Josephine. Did you know about this? I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Over the next 2 hours, my phone filled with similar messages. Jessica Walsh, this can't be a coincidence, call me. Kevin Murphy, what the hell is going on? Even Richard Henderson 3, Josephine, we need to talk. This is a very delicate situation. I responded to none of them. Instead, I spent the morning reviewing the integration timeline David had sent me. The plan was methodical and comprehensive. Financial audits, operational assessments, client retention strategies, and personnel evaluations. Every aspect of Henderson and Associates would be examined, analyzed, and either preserved or discarded based on its value to the combined organization. My first official task was to review Henderson's organizational chart and identify key personnel for retention. I pulled up the document I knew by heart, the same structure I'd been part of for 12 years, now viewed through the lens of strategic analysis rather than daily collaboration. The irony was almost overwhelming. 6 weeks ago, Tom Bradley and Jessica Walsh had been questioning my technological competence and strategic vision. Now I was being asked to evaluate their professional worth and determine their futures within the merged organization. At 11:30 a.m., I received an email that changed everything about how I viewed the past few months. It was from Patricia Santos at Hartwell Industries, sent to my Meridian email address. Josephine, congratulations on the new role. I wanted to reach out because we've been incredibly impressed with your strategic thinking and client service over the years. Given yesterday's announcement about the Meridian-Henderson merger, we'd like to discuss transitioning our account to work directly with you at Meridian. When would be a good time to talk? I reread the email twice, focusing on one particular phrase, yesterday's announcement. But the acquisition had been announced that morning, not yesterday. I checked the timestamp on Patricia's email. It had been sent at 4:23 p.m. the previous day. A quick search through my industry contacts revealed the truth. News of the acquisition had been circulating in client circles for at least 24 hours before the official announcement. Several major Henderson clients had already begun reaching out to Meridian to discuss account transitions. That meant my former colleagues had spent their first day back from winter break fielding calls, from clients who were essentially asking to be transferred to their former supervisor. The woman they'd spent months portraying as technologically incompetent and strategically outdated was now in a position to inherit their most valuable accounts. At 1:15 p.m., I received the call I'd been expecting since morning. Josephine, it's Richard Henderson. I think we need to meet. Hello, Richard. Congratulations on the acquisition. I'm sure it's an exciting time for everyone at Henderson and Associates. There was a pause. Can we drop the pleasantries? You know exactly why I'm calling. I assume it's about the integration process. I'll be scheduling meetings with department heads over the next few weeks to discuss operational transitions. Josephine, let's be honest about what's happening here. You left Henderson under less than ideal circumstances, and now you're in a position to make decisions about our people's futures. I'm asking you to approach this professionally. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. Richard, I need to be very clear about something. I didn't create this situation. I applied for a job at a company that happened to be acquiring my former employer. The fact that my former colleagues spent months undermining my credibility and questioning my competence doesn't change my professional obligations to Meridian. What are you saying? I'm saying that every personnel decision I make will be based on merit, performance data, and strategic value to the organization. Just like every other business decision. And Tom's promotion, Jessica's new responsibilities, will be evaluated along with everything else. No one gets special treatment, Richard. Not even me. After I hung up, I walked to my office window and looked down at the city below. Somewhere in that maze of glass and steel, Tom Bradley was probably realizing that his promotion to Director of Digital Innovation might not mean much if the Digital Innovation Department was eliminated during integration. Jessica Walsh was likely discovering that Acting Creative Director is a very different title when the organization chart is being redrawn by someone else. The awakening wasn't just about understanding the scope of my new authority. It was about recognizing that everything I'd interpreted as professional failure over the past few months had actually been preparation for this moment. Every slight, every condescending comment, Every strategic exclusion had given me valuable insight into the personalities and priorities of the people I would now be evaluating. They had shown me exactly who they were when they thought I had no power to respond. Now I knew exactly who they were when I had all the power in the world. My phone buzzed with another text message, this one from Jessica Walsh. "We need to talk. This whole situation is insane." I looked at the message for a moment, then typed back a single word. Monday. Because on Monday, the real work would begin. The integration meetings, the personnel reviews, the strategic assessments that would determine which Henderson employees had a future with Meridian Marketing Group. On Monday, I would walk back into the building I'd left in the rain 6 weeks earlier. But this time, I wouldn't be looking for acceptance or approval from my former colleagues. This time, they would be looking for it from me. The weekend that followed the acquisition announcement was the most strategically productive 48 hours of my professional life. While my former colleagues were presumably panicking about their futures, I was methodically constructing the framework that would determine those futures. I spent Saturday morning in my home office, surrounded by financial reports, organizational charts, and performance data that Meridian's due diligence team had compiled over the past 3 months. The scope of information was remarkable. Not just basic metrics like revenue and client retention, but detailed analyses of individual employee productivity, project success rates, and even internal communication patterns. What emerged from the data was a picture of Henderson and Associates that was both familiar and surprising. The company was financially stable, but strategically stagnant. Revenue had grown by only 3% over the past 2 years, well below industry averages. Client satisfaction scores were solid, but not exceptional. Most tellingly, the company had lost 6 significant accounts in the past 18 months, a pattern that coincided exactly with the period when Tom Bradley and Jessica Walsh had begun positioning themselves for leadership roles. The personnel data was even more revealing. Tom's individual performance metrics showed a troubling pattern: high visibility projects with mediocre results. His campaigns generated attention but rarely delivered sustained value for clients. Jessica's data revealed a different issue. She was excellent at managing existing projects, but had never successfully originated new business. Kevin Murphy from account management appeared competent but unremarkable, the kind of employee who could execute other people's strategies but couldn't develop his own. Then there were the employees I'd barely considered during my final months at Henderson. Sarah Chen, the Northwestern graduate I'd mentored, had quietly become one of the company's most effective strategists. Her campaigns consistently exceeded performance benchmarks, and client feedback specifically praised her innovative approaches. David Rodriguez had developed 3 proprietary marketing tools that were now being used company-wide. Maria Santos, a junior account manager I'd hired 2 years earlier, had the highest client retention rate in the company. The pattern was clear. While Tom and Jessica had been playing office politics, other employees had been doing the actual work that kept the company profitable. On Saturday afternoon, I drove to a coffee shop in Evanston, far enough from downtown Chicago that I wouldn't accidentally encounter anyone from either Henderson or Meridian. I needed space to think without the weight of familiar surroundings influencing my decisions. I opened my laptop and began creating what I privately called the integration matrix, a comprehensive framework for evaluating every Henderson employee based on quantifiable criteria. Performance metrics accounted for 40% of each person's score. Client feedback represented 25%. Innovation and strategic thinking comprised 20%. Cultural fit with Meridian's values made up 10%. The final 5% was reserved for what I termed leadership potential under pressure, essentially how people behaved when they thought no one was watching. It was this final category that would prove most damaging to Tom and Jessica. I had extensive documentation of their behavior during my final months at Henderson. The conversations I'd overheard about my supposed technological incompetence, the client presentation they'd redesigned without consultation, the systematic exclusion from meetings and decisions, the rain incident that had crystallized their true character. But I also had positive data about their colleagues. Sarah Chen's willingness to stay late to help struggling team members. David Rodriguez's habit of sharing credit for collaborative projects. Maria Santos's pattern of volunteering for difficult clients that others avoided. The integration matrix wasn't about revenge. It was about creating an objective system that would inevitably reflect the subjective reality of who these people actually were as professionals and colleagues. Sunday morning brought an unexpected complication. I was reviewing client transition strategies when my phone rang with a call from Michael Hartwell himself. "Josephine, I hope you don't mind me calling on a Sunday. Patricia gave me your number. I wanted to discuss the Hartwell account transition personally." "Of course, Michael. What are your concerns?" "Honestly, I'm thrilled about this development. Working with you at Meridian feels like a natural evolution of our partnership, but I wanted you to know that Henderson has been calling all weekend, trying to convince us to stay with their team." This was interesting. "What kind of arguments are they making?" Tom Bradley called yesterday evening. He emphasized continuity, said that transitioning accounts during a merger would be disruptive and unnecessary. He also suggested that you might be too busy with integration responsibilities to give Hartwell the attention we deserve. I made notes as Michael talked. Tom was already trying to use my new responsibilities against me, positioning himself as the more available option. "Jessica Walsh called this morning," Michael continued. "She took a different approach, said she'd been the primary strategist on our recent campaigns, and that losing her input would set back our momentum." This was a fascinating insight into their desperation. Jessica was taking credit for work she'd barely contributed to, banking on the assumption that clients wouldn't know the difference. "What did you tell them?" I asked. "The truth. That Hartwell Industries follows talent, not company names. We've been working with you for 8 years, not with Henderson and Associates. If you're at Meridian, that's where we want to be." After the call ended, I realized that Tom and Jessica weren't just fighting for their jobs. They were fighting for their professional credibility. Losing major clients to me would be more than a financial blow. It would be a public admission that their claims about my obsolescence had been wrong. That afternoon, I received similar calls from 3 other Henderson clients. The pattern was identical. Frantic outreach from my former colleagues, coupled with clear client preference for continuing our working relationships at Meridian. By Sunday evening, I had commitments from clients representing approximately $8.2 million in annual billings, nearly 40% of Henderson's total revenue. This presented an interesting strategic opportunity. Under the terms of the acquisition, Meridian had committed to retaining Henderson's existing staff where appropriate for operational efficiency. However, if 40% of Henderson's revenue was voluntarily transferring to work directly with me, the operational justification for maintaining duplicate departments would disappear. I spent Sunday evening refining the integration matrix, incorporating the weekend's new information. Tom Bradley's score had dropped significantly due to his desperate client retention tactics and his willingness to misrepresent Jessica's contributions. Jessica's score suffered from her false claims about strategic leadership and her apparent coordination with Tom to undermine the transition process. Conversely, several other Henderson employees had gained points. Sarah Chen had reached out on Saturday to congratulate me and offer assistance with the transition, demonstrating exactly the kind of professional grace that successful mergers require. David Rodriguez had sent a thoughtful email outlining potential synergies between Henderson and Meridian's technical capabilities. Maria Santos had forwarded client feedback that specifically requested to continue working with me, along with her own analysis of how to make the transition seamless. By Monday morning, I had a complete strategic framework for the integration process. More importantly, I had a clear understanding of which Henderson employees deserved to survive the merger, and which had eliminated themselves through their own actions. The integration meetings were scheduled to begin at 9 a.m. Monday morning at Henderson's offices. I would be returning to the building I'd left in defeat 6 weeks earlier, but this time I would be carrying a portfolio that would determine the professional fate of everyone who had contributed to that defeat. I laid out my clothes Sunday night, a charcoal gray suit that projected authority without aggression, paired with the same leather portfolio I'd carried to important client meetings for years. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a seasoned professional who had been entrusted with making difficult decisions. The irony wasn't lost on me that Tom Bradley and Jessica Walsh would probably spend Sunday night preparing presentations designed to convince me of their value to the organization. They would be trying to impress the same person they'd spent months portraying as incompetent and out of touch. But the most satisfying part of my preparation wasn't the strategic framework or the performance data or even the client commitments. It was the knowledge that everything I was about to do would be completely professional, entirely justified, and absolutely devastating to people who had earned every consequence they were about to face. I had spent my weekend planning not just an integration, but a reckoning. And unlike the rain-soaked bus stop where they'd left me 6 weeks earlier, this time I would be the one deciding who got left behind. I arrived at Henderson and Associates at 8:45 a.m. on Monday morning, 15 minutes before the scheduled integration meetings were set to begin. The familiar marble lobby felt different somehow, smaller, less impressive, like returning to your childhood home and realizing it was never as grand as your memories suggested. Marcus, the security guard who had greeted me every morning for 12 years, looked up from his desk with genuine surprise and what might have been relief. "Miss Miller, good to see you back. Though I have to say, nobody told me you were coming today." "I'm here for the integration meetings, Marcus. I'll be working with the team for the next few weeks." His expression shifted to curiosity, but he simply nodded and handed me a visitor's badge. The irony of needing visitor access to a building where I'd been an employee for over a decade wasn't lost on me, but it also felt symbolically appropriate. I wasn't returning as a former colleague seeking reinstatement. I was arriving as an outside authority figure conducting business. The elevator ride to the 14th floor gave me time to center myself. Through the mirrored walls, I could see my reflection. Composed, professional, carrying the leather portfolio that contained the integration matrix, and supporting documentation that would reshape this company. I looked like exactly what I was, someone who had been given significant responsibility and intended to execute it flawlessly. When the elevator doors opened, I found the entire Henderson creative department gathered in the main conference room. Through the glass walls, I could see them arranged around the table like defendants awaiting trial. Tom Bradley sat at the head of the table, clearly trying to project leadership authority. Jessica Walsh was to his right, taking notes on a legal pad with the kind of intense focus that suggested extreme nervousness. Kevin Murphy looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. But what struck me most was the presence of people I hadn't expected to see. Sarah Chen, David Rodriguez, and Maria Santos were also in the room, along with several other employees from different departments. This wasn't just a meeting with my former tormentors. It was a company-wide gathering to witness the beginning of the integration process. I walked into the conference room at exactly 9 a.m. The conversations that had been buzzing around the table stopped immediately, creating a silence so complete that I could hear the air conditioning system cycling on. "Good morning, everyone," I said, settling into the chair at the opposite end of the table from Tom. "Thank you for accommodating this early meeting. I know the acquisition announcement was unexpected for many of you." Tom cleared his throat. "Josephine, we're all excited to work together during this transition period. I think you'll find that the department has made significant progress since." "I'll be conducting individual assessments over the next 2 weeks," I interrupted smoothly. "Today's meeting is to outline the evaluation process and timeline." I opened my portfolio and distributed copies of a document I'd prepared over the weekend. A formal integration schedule that detailed meetings, reviews, and decision deadlines. The document was professional, comprehensive, and deliberately impersonal. "As you can see," I continued, "every employee will participate in a structured evaluation process. This will include performance reviews, client feedback assessments, and strategic planning discussions. The goal is to identify the optimal organizational structure for the combined Meridian Henderson operations." Jessica raised her hand tentatively. "When you say optimal organizational structure, are you referring to potential layoffs?" "I'm referring to ensuring that every position in the new organization is filled by the person best qualified to excel in that role," I replied. "Some positions may be eliminated due to redundancy. Others may be created to address new opportunities. Each decision will be based on objective performance data and strategic value." The room remained silent as people absorbed the implications. I could see various expressions around the table: fear, resignation, determination, and in Tom's case, barely concealed anger. "I'd like to begin with department heads," I said. "Tom, could you stay after this meeting? We'll start with your evaluation." Over the next hour, I outlined the integration timeline and answered questions about the process. Most of the questions came from employees who had genuine concerns about their futures. Tom and Jessica asked very few questions, probably because they suspected they already knew the answers. When the general meeting ended, most employees filed out of the conference room, leaving just Tom and me at opposite ends of the long table. The dynamic was fascinating. 6 weeks earlier, he'd been my junior colleague challenging my authority. Now he was essentially interviewing for his professional survival. "So," Tom said with forced casualness, "this is quite a role reversal." "Is it?" I replied, pulling out a thick folder with his name on it. "I see it more as a natural progression. You wanted leadership responsibility, and now you're being evaluated for it." I opened the folder and spread out several documents: his performance reviews, client feedback reports, and project outcome analyses. Tom's confident expression faltered as he realized the scope of documentation I'd compiled. "Let's start with the Hartwell Industries presentation," I said. "Can you walk me through your decision-making process for redesigning my strategy without consultation?" Tom's face reddened. That was a collaborative effort to modernize the approach. "According to the client feedback I received this weekend, the presentation failed to address their core concerns and nearly cost Henderson the account. How do you reconcile that with your assessment that the strategy needed modernization?" For the next 45 minutes, I systematically walked Tom through every questionable decision he'd made over the past 6 months. The client projects where his flashy approaches had produced minimal results. The team meetings where he'd undermined colleagues to advance his own agenda. The systematic campaign to position me as technologically incompetent while taking credit for digital campaigns I'd actually developed. "The most concerning pattern," I said, consulting my notes, "is your tendency to prioritize personal advancement over team success and client outcomes. Can you give me an example of a project where you placed client needs ahead of your own career interests?" Tom struggled to answer, offering vague references to collaborative efforts and strategic thinking without providing specific examples. His responses revealed exactly what I'd suspected. He was much better at talking about leadership than actually demonstrating it. "One final question," I said, closing his folder. "During my final week at Henderson, you offered me a ride home during that rainstorm, then drove away when I declined. Can you explain the thought process behind that decision?" The question clearly caught him off guard. That was just, "We were trying to be helpful, but you seemed determined to. You were trying to create a scenario where I would be grateful for your assistance, and when I refused to play that role, you abandoned me in a storm. Is that an accurate summary?" Tom's silence was answer enough. "I'll have a decision about your position by Friday," I said, standing up. "Please send Jessica in." Jessica's evaluation followed a similar pattern, though her responses revealed different weaknesses. Where Tom was aggressively self-promoting, Jessica was defensively manipulative. She consistently tried to reframe collaborative projects as her individual achievements, while downplaying the contributions of others. "Let's discuss the Morrison Restaurant Group campaign," I said, referencing one of our most successful projects from the previous year. "Your LinkedIn profile lists you as the lead strategist for this campaign. Can you walk me through your specific contributions?" Jessica launched into a detailed explanation that bore only passing resemblance to reality. She described strategic decisions I'd made as her own insights and presented implementation work done by Sarah Chen as her personal accomplishments. "That's interesting," I said when she finished. "Because I have the original project files here, including timestamped emails and revision histories that tell a very different story." I pulled out a bound document that detailed the actual workflow for the Morrison campaign. Every email, every revision, every strategic decision was documented with dates, times, and attribution. Jessica's face went pale as she realized the extent of my documentation. "Would you like to revise your description of your role in this project?" I asked. The rest of Jessica's evaluation proceeded in similar fashion. Every claim she made about her contributions was contradicted by documented evidence. Every attempt to minimize others' work was countered with proof of their actual achievements. By the time I finished with both Tom and Jessica, it was nearly noon. I had 4 more evaluations scheduled for the afternoon, but I already had the information I needed for the most important decisions. As I packed up my materials, I reflected on how different this confrontation had been from what I'd expected. There had been no dramatic arguments, no emotional outbursts, no desperate pleas for mercy. It had been entirely professional, completely documented, and absolutely devastating. Tom Bradley and Jessica Walsh had spent months positioning themselves as my inevitable replacements. They'd questioned my competence, undermined my authority, and ultimately abandoned me in a rainstorm because they thought I was powerless to respond. Now they knew exactly how powerless they actually were. The confrontation wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. And accountability, delivered with precision and documentation, was far more devastating than any emotional response could have been. Friday's decisions would surprise no one who had been paying attention to the evidence. The final integration meeting was scheduled for Friday at 3 p.m. in Henderson's main conference room, the same space where Tom Bradley had unveiled his disastrous Hartwell Industries presentation just 8 weeks earlier. This time, however, I would be the one presenting, and the stakes would be considerably higher than a single client account. I arrived 30 minutes early to set up the presentation materials and prepare the room. The afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast long shadows across the conference table, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere for what would essentially be a professional judgment day. At 2:55 p.m., the entire Henderson staff filed into the room. The energy was palpably tense. People took their seats quietly, avoiding eye contact, clearly bracing for news that would reshape their careers. Tom Bradley and Jessica Walsh sat together near the back, their body language suggesting they'd spent the week preparing for the worst. In contrast, Sarah Chen, David Rodriguez, and Maria Santos appeared nervous but hopeful, positioned closer to the front of the room. Richard Henderson, 3, entered last, settling into a chair along the side wall. As the outgoing president, he would witness the dismantling of the organization he'd inherited from his father, but he would have no say in the decisions I was about to announce. "Thank you all for your patience during this evaluation process," I began, standing at the head of the table with the same confidence I'd once brought to client presentations. The integration of Henderson and Associates into Meridian Marketing Group represents an opportunity to build something stronger than either organization could achieve independently. I clicked to the first slide of my presentation, a new organizational chart for the combined Chicago operations. The Meridian-Henderson integration will result in several significant changes. Some positions will be eliminated due to redundancy. Others will be enhanced or newly created to capitalize on emerging opportunities. Every decision has been based on performance data, client feedback, and strategic value to the combined organization. The room was absolutely silent. I could see people scanning the organizational chart, looking for their names, trying to decode their futures from boxes and connecting lines. "Let's start with the leadership structure," I continued, advancing to the next slide. "The position of Director of Digital Innovation will be eliminated. Our analysis indicates that this role, as currently defined, creates operational redundancy without adding strategic value." Tom Bradley's face went white. The promotion he'd fought so hard to obtain, the title he'd used to justify undermining me, had been erased with a single decision. Instead, we'll be creating a new position, Director of Integrated Strategy. This role will oversee both traditional and digital marketing approaches, ensuring that technological innovation serves strategic objectives rather than replacing them. I clicked to the next slide, which displayed the qualifications for the new position: extensive client relationship experience, proven track record of successful campaign development, demonstrated ability to mentor and develop team members, and strategic thinking that balances innovation with practical implementation. This position will be filled by Sarah Chen, who will be promoted from senior strategist effective immediately. The announcement sent a visible ripple through the room. Sarah's face showed shock and gratitude in equal measure, while Tom looked like he'd been physically struck. The person he'd dismissed as inexperienced and overly cautious was now his superior. Quote, "The creative director position will also undergo significant changes," I continued. "Jessica Walsh's interim appointment will not be made permanent. Instead, this role will be restructured to focus on collaborative leadership and cross-functional project management." Jessica's attempt to maintain composure was failing visibly. She'd spent months positioning herself as the inevitable successor to my role, only to watch it be redefined around skills she'd never demonstrated. The new creative director will be David Rodriguez, whose innovative thinking and collaborative approach align perfectly with Meridian's organizational culture. David's promotion was equally surprising to the room, though the supporting data I'd compiled made it inevitable. His technical innovations, combined with his habit of sharing credit and supporting colleagues, represented exactly the kind of leadership that successful organizations require. Several other promotions will take effect immediately, I said, advancing through slides that detailed Maria Santos's advancement to senior account manager and similar elevations for employees who had demonstrated both competence and character during the evaluation process. Then came the part of the presentation that everyone had been dreading. Unfortunately, the integration process also requires difficult decisions about redundant positions. The following employees will be offered severance packages and transition assistance, but their roles will not continue in the combined organization. The list was short, but devastating. Tom Bradley, Jessica Walsh, and Kevin Murphy, along with 3 other employees whose performance had been consistently problematic, would be leaving the company. These decisions were not made lightly, I said, looking directly at Tom and Jessica. Each was based on comprehensive performance analysis, client feedback, and assessment of cultural fit with Meridian's values. Severance details and transition timelines will be provided in individual meetings next week. Tom Bradley stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is personal," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of anger and desperation. "You're punishing us because we questioned your methods." I regarded him calmly. "Tom, you questioned my technological competence while taking credit for digital campaigns I'd developed. You redesigned client presentations without consultation, resulting in nearly lost accounts. You consistently prioritized personal advancement over team success and client outcomes. These decisions are based on documented performance patterns, not personal grievances. You can't seriously think Sarah and David are more qualified for leadership roles than Jessica and me," he continued, his professional composure completely abandoned. "I think they've demonstrated the qualities that effective leaders actually possess," I replied. "Strategic thinking, collaborative approaches, and genuine concern for client success and team development. The evaluation metrics are available for your review if you'd like to understand the specific criteria." Jessica finally spoke up, her voice trembling with barely controlled emotion. "You planned this from the beginning. The whole acquisition, your new job, all of it was designed to get back at us." I paused before responding, considering how much truth to reveal. "Jessica, I applied for a position at Meridian Marketing Group because it represented a career advancement opportunity. The fact that Meridian was acquiring Henderson wasn't known to me until after I'd started my new role. However, I will say this. The way you and Tom treated me during my final months at Henderson provided valuable insight into your characters and professional priorities. That insight proved useful during the evaluation process." Richard Henderson finally spoke from his position along the wall. "Josephine, these are significant organizational changes. Are you confident that the new structure will maintain operational continuity?" "Absolutely," I replied, clicking to a final slide that displayed client transition data. In fact, accounts representing $8.2 million in annual billing have already requested to work directly with the combined organization. The structural changes we're implementing are designed to support that growth while maintaining the relationships that drive it. The number was devastating in its implications. Nearly 40% of Henderson's revenue was voluntarily following me to Meridian, validating every decision I'd made about personnel and organizational structure. The meeting concluded with administrative details about transition timelines and integration logistics. As people filed out of the conference room, the emotional spectrum was remarkable. Relief from those who had been promoted or retained, shock from those who were being eliminated, and a general sense of witnessing something unprecedented. Tom Bradley and Jessica Walsh left without speaking to me or to each other. Their professional partnership, built on mutual ambition and shared disdain for colleagues they considered inferior, had dissolved under the pressure of actual accountability. Sarah Chen approached me as I was packing up my presentation materials. "Josephine, I don't know what to say. This opportunity is incredible, but I have to ask, are you sure I'm ready for this level of responsibility?" I smiled at her. the first genuine smile I'd worn in that building in months. "Sarah, you've been doing director-level work for 2 years. You just didn't have the title or the recognition. Now you have both." David Rodriguez was next, his expression mixing gratitude with determination. "I won't let you down," he said simply. "I know you won't," I replied. "That's why you're getting the opportunity." As I walked through the Henderson offices for what would probably be the last time, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 weeks earlier, I'd left this building defeated, soaked by rain, abandoned by people I'd trusted and mentored. I'd felt like my career was ending, like my experience and dedication had been rendered obsolete by younger, more ambitious colleagues. Now I was leaving as the architect of a new organization that would reward merit over politics, collaboration over manipulation, and genuine leadership over self-promotion. The people who had undermined me were unemployed. The people who had supported excellence and integrity were in positions to shape the future. The resolution wasn't about revenge, though it certainly felt satisfying. It was about creating an organization that reflected the values I'd always believed in, that experience matters, that character counts, and that professional success should be based on contribution rather than self-aggrandizement. As I walked out of the Henderson & Associates building for the final time, I thought about the text message I'd received that morning from Patricia Santos at Hartwell Industries. "Congratulations on the successful integration. We're excited to continue our partnership with you at Meridian." The rain had stopped, both literally and metaphorically. The storm that had left me standing alone at a bus stop had ultimately washed away everything that wasn't built on solid ground. And what remained was stronger than anything I could have built while playing by someone else's rules. Sometimes the best revenge is simply doing your job extraordinarily well, especially when your job includes deciding who gets to keep theirs. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. "Thank you all for your patience during this evaluation process," I began, standing at the head of the table with the same confidence I'd once brought to client presentations. The integration of Henderson & Associates into Meridian Marketing Group represents an opportunity to build something stronger than either organization could achieve independently. I clicked to the first slide of my presentation, a new organizational chart for the combined Chicago operations. The Meridian-Henderson integration will result in several significant changes. Some positions will be eliminated due to redundancy. Others will be enhanced or newly created to capitalize on emerging opportunities. Every decision has been based on performance data, client feedback, and strategic value to the combined organization. The room was absolutely silent. I could see people scanning the organizational chart, looking for their names, trying to decode their futures from boxes and connecting lines. "Let's start with the leadership structure," I continued, advancing to the next slide. "The position of Director of Digital Innovation will be eliminated. Our analysis indicates that this role, as currently defined, creates operational redundancy without adding strategic value." Tom Bradley's face went white. The promotion he'd fought so hard to obtain, the title he'd used to justify undermining me, had been erased with a single decision. Instead, we'll be creating a new position, Director of Integrated Strategy. This role will oversee both traditional and digital marketing approaches, ensuring that technological innovations serve strategic objectives rather than replacing them. I clicked to the next slide, which displayed the qualifications for the new position: extensive client relationship experience, proven track record of successful campaign development, demonstrated ability to mentor and develop team members, and strategic thinking that balances innovation with practical implementation. This position will be filled by Sarah Chen, who will be promoted from senior strategist effective immediately. The announcement sent a visible ripple through the room. Sarah's face showed shock and gratitude in equal measure, while Tom looked like he'd been physically struck. The person he'd dismissed as inexperienced and overly cautious was now his superior. "The creative director position will also undergo significant changes," I continued. "Jessica Walsh's interim appointment will not be made permanent. Instead, this role will be restructured to focus on collaborative leadership and cross-functional project management." Jessica's attempt to maintain composure was failing visibly. She'd spent months positioning herself as the inevitable successor to my role, only to watch it be redefined around skills she'd never demonstrated. The new creative director will be David Rodriguez, whose innovative thinking and collaborative approach align perfectly with Meridian's organizational culture. David's promotion was equally surprising to the room, though the supporting data I'd compiled made it inevitable. His technical innovations, combined with his habit of sharing credit and supporting colleagues, represented exactly the kind of leadership that successful organizations require. Several other promotions will take effect immediately, I said, advancing through slides that detailed Maria Santos's advancement to senior account manager and similar elevations for employees who had demonstrated both competence and character during the evaluation process. Then came the part of the presentation that everyone had been dreading. Unfortunately, the integration process also requires difficult decisions about redundant positions. The following employees will be offered severance packages and transition assistance, but their roles will not continue in the combined organization. The list was short but devastating. Tom Bradley, Jessica Walsh, and Kevin Murphy, along with 3 other employees whose performance had been consistently problematic, would be leaving the company. These decisions were not made lightly, I said, looking directly at Tom and Jessica. Each was based on comprehensive performance analysis, client feedback, and assessment of cultural fit with Meridian's values. Severance details and transition timelines will be provided in individual meetings next week. Tom Bradley stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is personal," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of anger and desperation. "You're punishing us because we questioned your methods." I regarded him calmly. "Tom, you questioned my technological competence while taking credit for digital campaigns I'd developed. You redesigned client presentations without consultation, resulting in nearly lost accounts. You consistently prioritized personal advancement over team success and client outcomes. These decisions are based on documented performance patterns, not personal grievances. You can't seriously think Sarah and David are more qualified for leadership roles than Jessica and me," he continued, his professional composure completely abandoned. "I think they've demonstrated the qualities that effective leaders actually possess," I replied. "Strategic thinking, collaborative approaches, and genuine concern for client success and team development. The evaluation metrics are available for your review if you'd like to understand the specific criteria." Jessica finally spoke up, her voice trembling with barely controlled emotion. "You planned this from the beginning. The whole acquisition, your new job, all of it was designed to get back at us." I paused before responding, considering how much truth to reveal. "Jessica, I applied for a position at Meridian Marketing Group because it represented a career advancement opportunity. The fact that Meridian was acquiring Henderson wasn't known to me until after I'd started my new role. However, I will say this. The way you and Tom treated me during my final months at Henderson provided valuable insight into your characters and professional priorities. That insight proved useful during the evaluation process." Richard Henderson finally spoke from his position along the wall. "Josephine, these are significant organizational changes. Are you confident that the new structure will maintain operational continuity?" "Absolutely," I replied, clicking to a final slide that displayed client transition data. In fact, accounts representing $8.2 million in annual billing have already requested to work directly with the combined organization. The structural changes we're implementing are designed to support that growth while maintaining the relationships that drive it. The number was devastating in its implications. Nearly 40% of Henderson's revenue was voluntarily following me to Meridian, validating every decision I'd made about personnel and organizational structure. The meeting concluded with administrative details about transition timelines and integration logistics. As people filed out of the conference room, the emotional spectrum was remarkable. Relief from those who had been promoted or retained, shock from those who were being eliminated, and a general sense of witnessing something unprecedented. Tom Bradley and Jessica Walsh left without speaking to me or to each other. Their professional partnership, built on mutual ambition and shared disdain for colleagues they considered inferior, had dissolved under the pressure of actual accountability. Sarah Chen approached me as I was packing up my presentation materials. Josephine, I don't know what to say. This opportunity is incredible, but I have to ask, are you sure I'm ready for this level of responsibility? I smiled at her, the first genuine smile I'd worn in that building in months. Sarah, you've been doing director-level work for 2 years. You just didn't have the title or the recognition. Now you have both. David Rodriguez was next, his expression mixing gratitude with determination. I won't let you down, he said simply. I know you won't, I replied. That's why you're getting the opportunity. As I walked through the Henderson offices for what would probably be the last time, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 weeks earlier, I'd left this building defeated, soaked by rain, abandoned by people I'd trusted and mentored. I'd felt like my career was ending, like my experience and dedication had been rendered obsolete by younger, more ambitious colleagues. Now I was leaving as the architect of a new organization that would reward merit over politics, collaboration over manipulation, and genuine leadership over self-promotion. The people who had undermined me were unemployed. The people who had supported excellence and integrity were in positions to shape the future. The resolution wasn't about revenge, though it certainly felt satisfying. It was about creating an organization that reflected the values I'd always believed in, that experience matters, that character counts, and that professional success should be based on contribution rather than self-aggrandizement. As I walked out of the Henderson and Associates building for the final time, I thought about the text message I'd received that morning from Patricia Santos at Hartwell Industries. Congratulations on the successful integration. We're excited to continue our partnership with you at Meridian. The rain had stopped, both literally and metaphorically. The storm that had left me standing alone at a bus stop had ultimately washed away everything that wasn't built on solid ground. And what remained was stronger than anything I could have built while playing by someone else's rules. Sometimes the best revenge is simply doing your job extraordinarily well, especially when your job includes deciding who gets to keep theirs. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.